Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Ernest with the State Department in Washington, D.C., and we're lucky enough to have with us Larry Hama joining us to talk a little bit more about creating educational comics. Larry, go ahead and take it away.
Hi, I'm Larry Hama. I've been in the comic book business for over 40 years. I've been a writer, artist, letterer, colorist, and I was an editor at both Marvel and DC Comics. I'm going to open it up to questions, but I think I'll start with answering a question I already have, which was, could you describe your writing process and specifically how you help the artist transfer your script into images? Well, since I started out drawing, I was an illustrator first, and then I was a comic book penciler. And I did both of those for many years before anybody would let me write a comic. So I always approached writing comics from the visual end first. The way I do a story, this is purely personal, is I imagine the entire story as a visual series of pictures in my head, like a silent movie. And when I actually sit down at a word processor, I'm just describing that silent movie that I saw in my head. So a lot of times I say, well, I'm not a writer, I'm a penciler with a word processor. This is probably different than the way a lot of other writers who don't draw write comics, but to me, comics and film and television and other fields that I work in are primarily visual mediums, and creating for them all should really take the visual aspects in mind first. Does that answer that question?
I think that answers it perfectly.
Okay.
We've got another question coming in from Veronica in Venezuela, sort of on the same topic of having to draw comics yourself, and she wants to know if teachers have to be necessarily good drawers in order to create effective educational comics.
The teachers don't have to be skilled draftsmen, but they should understand the mechanics of how visual storytelling and sequential storytelling works. They should understand the methodology of how to set up a scene, how to introduce an environment, how to introduce the characters, how to make the characters accessible to the audience, and make the audience relate to those characters, and then have the characters relate whatever story or information you want them to have. You want them to relate. There are a lot of teachers who can draw terrifically, who don't have the wherewithal to get this information across. You know, teaching is more about the effectiveness of getting across the message rather than a facility with just drawing.
And on that note, what kind of messages do you think can be sent through comics? Any message, or are there some that are more effective that are shown through this media?
You can get across anything with a comic. The U.S. government has been using comics as educational form for decades. The Department of Defense had a publication, or still has a publication, called the Preventative Maintenance Monthly, which is basically a comic book that teaches people in the military how to maintain or fix a radio, or how to change a spark plug, or how to adjust the rotor blades in a helicopter. And it does so in a very visual and easily explainable way that isn't dependent on the words. You know, somebody whose reading abilities aren't terrific can look at these types of instructional comics and still gain an awful lot of practical information, and that's very important.
Yeah, I'd say that's very important. We have a question now coming in from Arequipa, Peru, and they're asking, how can we teach students the difference between the various vignettes that they use?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure I understand that. But
I think they're asking sort of how they can teach students different styles of drawing for particular messages. So if a certain style pertains more to a particular message or not.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, if you want to explain how to, if you're doing something instructional that's really practical, you know, about like how to adjust a well pump or whatever, then the style of drawing has to be extremely plain and simple and linear and clear. If you're dealing with ideas and abstractions, and you're talking about the concepts, you don't need that type of drawing. You could be, it could be far more impressionistic. It could be very stylized.
Okay, I think that's exactly what they wanted to know.
Okay.
We have a question now from Ricardo, and he wants to know specifically for G.I. Joe comics, but I think you can lay it out more clearly for every comic. How do you select what characters you're going to use? Is it editorial who gives you the selection? How does that process go? And he also says, thank you for the many years of G.I. Joe comics.
Okay. Well, thank you. The editorial is never, you know, since the very beginning, they've never told me what characters to use. I mean, the first 3 or 4 years of the comic, it was basically an ad for the toys. So the toy company would say, well, you have to use this guy and that guy, and because there would be commercials that included these figures. I just saw that as a challenge. I thought, wow, you know, I got to do a story that's got the Arctic trooper and a windsurfer in it at the same time. You know? And if you look at it as a challenge and say, wow, you know, this is going to be hard, but I can do it, then you come up with some pretty interesting stuff. Also, you know, I write everything pretty much page by page. I don't know what happens at the end of the story until I actually get to the end of the story. So lots of times I arbitrarily choose a cast. Say, well, okay, I'm going to use Snake Eyes and Roadblock and Scarlet and Lady J and Cutter, and for no other reason than, you know, I like the way they look, or
You just feel like drawing them that day?
I just feel like, you know, drawing or of them or talking about them or whatever. So, and that way I could put them into the situation and let them sort of write the story themselves. So.
Perfect. We've got tons of questions coming in. I know we've got viewing parties in Trinidad and Tobago and also from Chile.
Okay.
One question we've got coming in from Trinidad and Tobago is, over time, how has your method evolved for changing audiences? And how do you think that readers today are different from those in the 80s? Are they different? What are your thoughts?
It's probably very different. I mean, when I first started writing G.I. Joe, I would go to a store signing, and it was all 10 and 11-year-old boys. Um, I noticed that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I'd go to a store signing, and everybody was over 30. And a lot of mailmen who had skipped off on their route to come get their books signed for some reason. But I think the audience changed because the audience was growing older as the books were being published, and the comic companies never really wanted to go back after the kid market, because when the kid market sort of fell off, the publishers became really dependent on the collector market, and we're figuring out ways to try to drive the collector market by having alternate covers and so on and so forth. So,
do you think? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you think that the comic book scene is growing again based on movies that are being released that are based on comic books, or do they have any relation to one another?
Oh, I think it's growing for a lot of different reasons. There's a new interest in comics that's sort of a spring back from the movies, and there's a surge in what we used to call the indies, the independent publishers, which means that there's a lot more diversity and different types of comics out there, other than just the same old superheroes, and a lot more female creators out there doing really impressive stuff, and the manga interest has also increased the female interest in the medium. A friend of mine was saying, well, he went into a comic shop the first time in a long time, and he realized that like 50% of the people in there were women. And he said, that was sort of a shock to him. And that has a lot of factors contributing to it. The manga thing, TV, and the increased activity in the indie market.
Wonderful. We have so many questions coming in, it's hard to organize them all. Norman would like to know, what was your learning process to become an artist? But I think more basically, do you think there's a certain educational path or career path that someone needs to become an artist?
Well, you can't really mythologize, make it into a method, because I've seen so many people come from so many different routes, and I've seen people who just sort of just magically appeared with incredible powers to do amazing drawings. And I've seen other people struggle mightily to learn it, by rote. It was always a struggle for myself, that I had to really work hard to get one iota better, and then I would see people. There was one guy who came into our studio one day. He had never drawn anything until he'd gone into the Army, and then all of a sudden he could sort of draw like Michelangelo. And he had this amazing sketchbook, and everybody was just totally blown away. And like, wow, where did you study? Where did you? He said, I just picked up a pencil one day. And Neil Adams, who ran the studio, said of him, this guy's name was Ed Davis, he said, you know, nobody ever told Ed he couldn't do it. He doesn't know that what he does is impossible. And you know, I've seen other guys like Michael Golden or this Korean artist Jun. They draw as if they had a kundalini eye in the middle of their forehead that was beaming the image out onto the paper, and all they were doing was tracing it. You know, these guys, they could start a drawing in the upper left-hand corner and then make it appear like a scan, and then end the drawing in the bottom right-hand corner without doing any sketching or,
wow,
you know, things first. When you actually see somebody do that, it's jaw-dropping, because I think they really are seeing the entire thing in their head first. And you know, with me, I'm just noodling away until I get it. You know, it's a lot for me. A lot of it is just luck. But yeah, it's and I went to a specialized high school in New York City. I went to the High School of Art and Design. That used to be called the School of Industrial Art, SIA, and a huge percentage of the comic book artists that came out of New York all went to that school. And I was very lucky at that school to have an illustration teacher named Bernard Krigstein, who had been a really top comic artist for EC Comics in the 50s and was incredibly influential. And you know, from there I went to being an assistant for Wally Wood, another very influential artist, and then I went to work in Neil Adams' studio, who was a really big star in comics and an incredible artist. So I was very lucky that I had teachers and mentors who were at the very pinnacle of the field. So I got to learn from the best. But I think that's the best way to go about it, is to put yourself in a situation where you could learn from really good people.
I think that's great advice.
You know, no matter what you have to do, because you could learn more in just a few months with somebody who's amazingly good at what they do than, you know, 4 years studying with somebody who's not that good or not that interested in imparting the information. Because I found that all the best people I've ever come across were incredibly generous with their help and with their willingness to teach. Because, you know, in the comics business, you know, the people that do it, or have always done it, were people that really loved it, and they want to see more. They want to see more good stuff. They want to encourage people that they see that are doing really good work, and help them along. I got helped along every step of the way, and I've always felt that, you know, I owe it to pay it back somehow, because, and you know, I've worked also with advertising in other fields where that was not the case. People were very sort of secretive and selfish. And
speaking of mentors, there's actually a guest who says he's 12 years old and would love to send you his drawings so you could give him advice to get better. maybe you don't necessarily have time to reach out to all of your fans, but could you give that guest some advice as to where to go, where he could get critiqued, sort of in his hometown, or a way for anyone who's interested in comics to sort of find mentors?
Well, it always was difficult. If you're in a small town someplace, it's really difficult. Before the internet, if you wanted to become an artist or an illustrator or a comic book artist, you pretty much had to pack up and move to New York City, and because that's where it all was. And all the publishers were within like 10 blocks of each other. You could just take your portfolio and walk from one office to the other, literally. And when I was working out of a studio in New York, I met people that took the bus in from Cleveland or Detroit, or Florida, from Toronto, from the West Coast, from the Deep South, everywhere, because there was no other way to do it. It's much easier with the internet that you could make yourself a page and put your stuff out there, and then you have the difficulty of cajoling somebody who knows what they're looking at to look at it. But the framework is set up there for it to be done. Before, it was impossible unless you had a bus ticket or a plane fare. So it's worth it to put together a site and get your work up there.
Mm-hmm. Or find forums with other people that have the same interests.
Or there are conventions everywhere. I've had people come up to me at conventions and show me their work, and sometimes I've been able to get them work.
Wow.
A lot of times I can't. I mean, because my taste may be a little eclectic.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that I liked, I would show to an editor, and the editors would not like it because it didn't look like what they were used to,
mm-hmm.
Which is a huge barrier to get over. If you want to get your foot in the door anywhere, doing anything, you pretty much have to do work that looks like what people are already buying. Then, once you've got your foot in the door, you can branch out and do your own style. But people are only buying what they've been buying. they don't. Nobody in the entertainment businesses is out to be number one. They're all out to be number two, because that's safe. Being number one is extremely risky, and nobody wants to risk it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you can do things that look like what's very popular currently, then you can get your foot in the door.
I think that's great advice.
Yeah, if you're completely, no matter how brilliant it is, if you're completely alien to what they're used to, there's no parameters for the editors or the art directors to judge the work. Then, there's no way for them to even describe it. So
something a little more familiar, and then once you've sort of gotten your foot in the door, you're able to branch out and maybe create new items in a genre.
Well, the thing that you have to ask yourself is, like, how do I get my foot in the door?
Mm-hmm.
Everything else comes after that.
So your advice would be to find some mentors who are willing to help you, as well as put your work out there so that it can be seen, and so you may have a chance to find those mentors.
Right.
Okay. Great. So we now have a few questions coming in from, I'm guessing, teachers. Diego wants to know how you can use comics in elementary school, whether it's better to maybe sort of have the students read the comics first or to have them start creating already. What would you say?
Well, I think to have them create rudimentary storytelling right from the beginning, I think is pretty important, because learning how to make something teaches you how to appreciate it. So that's the thing about pedagogy, about teaching, is that in order to impart your information, you have to arrange it in your own head and understand it in your own head. And prior to that, a lot of your skill or knowledge is sort of this amorphous thing swirling around in your consciousness, and you don't know how you do that. But if you're forced to show or teach somebody else how to do it, you have to systematize your process in your head and say, oh, well, what I really do is I start here, and this is step 1, and then this is step 2, and this is step 3, and this is how I do it. And then you can explain it to somebody else. So, getting back to that original question, is that, if you teach a kid how to do a basic storytelling, with very basic pictures, even with stick figures, then they can appreciate another level of storytelling in visual storytelling when they see it, because then they're privy to the process. Mm-hmm. They understand the process. They understand, oh, and as soon as a kid makes that connection and sees and understands how something is done, that takes the mystery out of it, and
they're better able to relate to it.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So someone is working with high school students. Marco from the U.S. Embassy in Chile wants to know if you think that making digital comics can grab the attention of high school students. So I think more generally, it's how do you see the role of digital comics in educational comics?
Well, I mean, the thing with digital comics is a matter of distribution. You can get it out there on a really wide scale, and you're not having to deal with the sordid mechanics of publishing on paper. We used to call it pushing immovable objects through high-speed presses. It was an odorous process, to say the least. And to live in a day and age where we could create all this stuff digitally, on a pad, never have it see paper, and go out there to literally billions of people. That's amazing. How could it not be better?
Absolutely. Okay, we've got our group of students watching from the U.S. Embassy in Lima. They want to know where your inspiration comes from to create stories and characters, and what is your purpose for making comics? What really drew you to that medium?
Well, I got interested in comics because I wanted to do funny animals. I was always an Uncle Scrooge fan, a Carl Barks fan, and I wanted to do Uncle Scrooge. I wanted to do Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and the Junior Woodchucks, and but nobody was buying that stuff. When I was trying to get into comics, it was the golden age of the funny animals was already dying on the vine, and superheroes was all the rage. This was in the 60s and early 70s. So that was the only work that was there. So I had to sort of switch over to doing what actually could pay the rent. Um,
And did you still do some of what you enjoyed, some of the funny animals on the side?
well, I created a Bucky O'Hare, which was a toy line from Hasbro, and a comic book from Continuity, and a TV show, and a whole lot of licenses. We sold lunchboxes and big wheels, and it was a lot of fun. And Nintendo, there were Nintendo games. Um,
So it was still a matter of getting your foot in your door and then going back to what you you like to do.
exactly, and I actually did pretty well by Bucky O'Hare, so I can't complain. There's lots of things that we just because it wasn't our first love doesn't mean that you can't put your heart into it. I had doing a military comic was the last thing on my mind, but what had happened was that Hasbro, the toy company, made a deal with Marvel. They said, well, it would be really cool to have a comic of our product. So and they said, well, Marvel's like the best. Let's go to Marvel and have a Marvel comic. The trouble was, in 1980, what is in the business called a toy book, a licensed comic, was the bottom of the barrel, and you got no respect for doing one. In fact, people told me, "Oh, that's a career killer. If you do this toy comic book, you'll be branded as the toy guy, and you'll never get any really good work on like the X-Men or whatever." So, but nobody was giving me any writing work, even though I was an editor, because they said, "Well, you're an artist, you can't write."
So you just wanted to prove them all wrong.
Well, I wanted to so I'd been asking for a year for something to write, and no editor would touch me with a 10-foot pole, and then until this Hasbro thing came along, and then they literally offered the comic to every single writer in the Marvel stable, and then to every editor, and then to every assistant editor, and every single one turned it down. And I was the last person on the list, because I had the last office at the end of the hall where it was dark. And they finally made their way down to the end of the hall, and they offered me this book, and I said, "I'll take it."
Seems to have worked out pretty well for you.
Yeah, but that's the way a lot of these things work.
Mm-hmm.
But I took on the book, and I thought, well, I'm giving this my best shot. I'm going to try to show them that I can really do this.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you have to do.
Pretty well for yourself.
Well, see, that's the thing about getting work in any of these fields, is that the books that they'll give you are the ones that like nobody else wants to do, right? And if you could take that book that's in the garbage can and turn it around,
Mm-hmm.
that's the real proving ground, and that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. So a lot of our viewers seem to be very interested in the drawing aspect of comics.
Okay.
So I'm going to throw a few questions at you. Coral wants to know what the secret to maintaining symmetry in a sequence is, and then others want to know how you developed your drawing skills and how they can then develop their drawing skills. Because some say I have a great idea and I'm used to writing the comics, but when it comes to drawing them, then I have problems. Alejandro says that to us. So if you can sort of address that, I think a lot of our fans would be appreciative.
Okay, there's two anecdotes that I always repeat about the drawing thing. That when I was in Bernie Kriegstein's class in high school, one of his requirements was that you had to keep a sketchbook and hand the sketchbook in every Friday, and he would like review your sketchbook. So one Friday I handed in my sketchbook, and there was one sketch in it. And he said, "Well, Hama, there's only one sketch in your sketchbook." And I said, "Well, I spent all week on that sketch." And he looked at me, and he said, "Before you do your first really good drawing, you have to do about 100,000 really sucky ones." And if I were you, I'd get that first 100,000 out of the way as fast as I could. Oh, and that taught me a couple of things about the non-preciousness of the stuff that I was doing, and the fact that trying to fix something that was bad is sort of a waste of time. At that stage in your development, just draw a lot, and really keep at it and draw real things. Look at reality and, do your version of the reality. I mean, human beings are hot-wired to be able to look at a three-dimensional world and figure out a way to depict it in 2 dimensions on a flat plane. We've got cave paintings that are 10,000 years old that prove that. That there wasn't a school for how to paint a bison on a cave wall. People thousands and thousands of miles and thousands of years apart figured out ways to do that, and it all looks similar. And a human being today can look at this thing that was drawn 15,000 years ago and tell what that thing was, and that's amazing. Okay, the second thing, this big sort of Satori light that went off in my head, was when I was working at Neil Adams' studio doing advertising stuff. I was doing storyboards, and it was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was sitting there drawing away, and my mentor Neil Adams is standing behind me drinking a coffee and eating a Linzer tart, and there's crumbs falling on my shoulders, and he says, "You're settling." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What's settling?" He says, "Well, this thing that you're drawing, in your head, you're seeing something a lot better than this. That's really fantastic. But, in your head, you're saying to yourself, well, that may be fantastic and really cool, but I don't think I can get away with that. I don't think I can pull that off. But here's what I can do. I can settle for this. And I do the easier thing that I already know that I could get away with doing." And every time you do that, every time you settle instead of pushing the envelope, that's the same as going to the gym and doing 1 push-up instead of 50. That's the equivalent of, doing 1 rep instead of 75.
You're not building your strengths or your talents.
You're not doing anything. You're just maintaining the flab. So, and that was a real sort of awakening. I said, "Well, yeah, that's what I do." I mean, and he said, "Yeah, and you rely on these templates in your head. You have this one eye that you know how to do, so you just keep doing that. You know how to do this. You have 3 ears. You have 4 hand gestures, and you just repeat these over and over again. But you never do like that, because that is hard to draw. And the first time you tried to draw that, it was terrible. So it's like touching a hot stove. You didn't want to do it again. But
right.
but you have to keep forcing yourself to do the stuff that's really hard, and then one day it starts to look good.
Well, on that note, Brian asks us, what's the hardest body part to draw? So that's a quick one, but he wants to know.
The hardest body part to draw. Again,
For you.
Neil Adams. Another Neil Adams story is as I was drawing, and he was looking over my shoulder, and he said, "I guess you don't know the 32 planes of the nose yet, do you?" So I turned around and I said, "Well, no, I don't. Why don't you show me?" And he said that, and he showed me. People are, a good people are willing to sit down and show you how to do stuff right. But learning the basics, it is just that. Sitting down and learning the basics on how to draw all the different body parts, and you don't learn that by cracking open a book.
Mm-hmm.
You learn that by live figure drawing. Figure drawing is the font from which it all springs. In the late '70s, when I was at DC Comics sponsored this thing where they said, "Well, we'll pay for like live figure models, and all of our artists can come in like every Wednesday in the afternoon after 5, and we'll set them up in the conference room, and we'll even spring for like cheese and crackers." and it was free to all the artists. And you know who showed up? All the best guys.
That's telling.
Michael Kaluta, and Bernie Wrightson, and Neil Adams, and Jim Starlin, and like the guys that could really, really draw were all the guys that showed up for the figure drawing classes and sessions. And the guys who were like third tier or second tier, we never saw them.
So the guys who succeeded, they know practice makes perfect, and you have to put some effort into what you're doing.
Well, they knew where it comes from,
mm-hmm.
And so signing up for a figure drawing class is, or whatever is important. If you can't do that, sketch real people
mm-hmm.
doing real things. That's the way you learn how to do real expressions. I mean, a lot of comic book people, artists, they have like, and that's it.
Yeah.
But like doing that's
a little more difficult, a little more practice.
A little bit more difficult, yeah. And
so in line with that, Ellen from Lima wants to know what tips you have to give to an illustrator to transmit a message successfully. Is it all in the emotion that the characters are showing, or are there smaller details that you can include, do you think?
Well, it's mostly in gesture and acting of the figures. Everything else is just set decoration. You take somebody, a cartoonist like Jules Pfeiffer, no backgrounds, it was all gesture and expression. And his stuff will stick around. There's these other guys that spend 90% of their time doing furniture and backgrounds. Sort of, it's very impressive in this sort of architectural rendering sort of way. And, everything's very shiny and super rendered, but you look at the people, and all the people are sort of like shiny and super rendered.
Mm.
Where's where's the intent? Where's the subtext? Where's what's going on behind their eyes? You know, where's the drama?
Very, very good points. Andres would like to know how much time you spend in the process of writing a 24-page comic book. Do you have any tips or tricks for it? And he also says, thanks, and Cobra! I'm sorry.
Well, I spend most of my time, I write comics. I've always written comics as a plot and then done the dialogue later. So it's called the Marvel style, is that you write a plot that pretty much just describes visually what's going on, right? And you throw in hints about what people are saying or what the gist of the conversation is. But it's up to the artist to do the storytelling and the acting. So the writer then gets back the pencil pages. I would get back the pencil pages, and I sit down and I figure out what people are saying and what's in the captions. I use very little captions. The captions I use are the next day in Peoria. I think the story should be told in the dialogue and in the pictures. Having long captions describing what's going on, I think that's anathema to a comic. It's like having movies that are just that have nothing but narration.
Okay, so we've got a hard-hitting question coming to us from the group of students at the U.S. Embassy in Lima. Janetta wants to know, why do you think that most superheroes just look out for citizens or individuals, and why don't they use their powers to solve broader, important issues like poverty, for example? It's a tough one.
Well, it's because a lot of those issues are not solvable within the fantasy structure of a superhero. Superheroes are a fantasy about control. They're fantasies about retribution. You have like the vigilante superhero. You have like Batman, who punishes people for just being bad. And he's psychotic. Then you have Superman, who is so wonderfully good that you can't figure out how he could be that good. He's this universal big brother who always makes the right decision. But I think in the process of writing stories for these characters over the years, all the writers found that, you can't, it's impossible to create scenarios where they solve problems, these massive world problems, because that would be totally unbelievable. Everyone knows that you just can't solve, that a superpowered being is not going to solve poverty. They're not going to solve, rampant ignorance. They're not going to solve, they're not going to make people stop hating each other for whatever reasons they hate each other. That's sort of a fascist dream, that a person of power can make people do that. That it's so that's the weird dichotomy about superheroes. I was interviewed once about superheroes for a documentary on NET, and the one line I said that made it into the documentary was I said, well, there's no such thing as jurisprudence man. that that we don't have a superhero called Fairness Guy. You know? uh, it's all these people that use force somehow.
Mhm.
Instead of like we don't have a superhero called the Logical Argument Fellow.
Yeah, and I think those characters would also be a little harder to relate to than the ones that exist now.
Oh, you'd hate them.
Okay, we've
That's
got a lot of questions coming in. We only have about 10 minutes left in the program, so I'm sorry,
okay.
viewers, we probably won't be able to get to all of the questions. But here's a good one about goals as a comic writer. What roles do goals play in your life? What role do you think that they should play? Do you set a certain goal for yourself every day, or are you going by a larger career goal?
You mean like page quota or something, or
No, I think they
what
mean
I'm trying to do.
what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve with your work.
Well, what I've always tried to do is I was sort of always upset by the sort of anti-hero thing that was very hot in comics at the time that I was trying to get writing work, and I thought, well, the heroes that I liked had a moral and ethical core, and I liked that. And I thought, I think that's how the type of stories I want to write are about role models that do have a very strong ethical core. They may have character flaws and weaknesses, but I think that's a way to point out the importance of their essential core. Is that and to if they had no weaknesses and flaws, you'd hate them also. I think so. I think that's important.
That's very true. You want to love and hate your characters sometimes,
Right.
But you want to be able to relate to them because nobody's perfect.
You want to see that they're human,
Right.
And otherwise they're just too out there.
Yeah. So Neil Abraham just has a comment. He wants to say, thanks, Larry, for your time and all your really helpful advice. He's sure many young artists have been inspired by your work and have learned so much from your discussion today. Thank you, Neil, for watching.
Okay. Thank you.
And the group in U.S. Embassy Lima also wants to ask, Kelly asks, what was the first comic you read, and what comics do you read the most often?
I think the first comic that I read, it would have to have been a Walt Disney or a Bugs Bunny or something like that. It was. I remember having them as a kid. These Dell, they were 10-cent Dell comics, or Bugs Bunny or Porky Pig, or there were Dell comics with Disney characters in them. But the first stories that I really sort of remember, or can remember remembering, are the Uncle Scrooge comics. And I was in my 20s until I found out who actually drew them. Because they weren't signed.
Oh.
But I think everybody, the kids in my generation who grew up with those Uncle Scrooge, Carl Barks comics, we thought of Uncle Carl Barks as the good artist. Even though we didn't know his name, we could tell what he had done, because it was so far above the others.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got another question from Richard. He says, he knows it's a hard question to answer, but from all the work that you've done, do you have one that you hold closest to your heart or that you relate to the most?
Well, the Bucky O'Hare stuff. I mean, that was what I really wanted to do, and I wish I could have kept on doing it.
I think the audience has enjoyed those too. So we're really down on time. We have about 4 minutes left. Can you leave our viewers Actually, we've got one more question.
Okay.
Do you prefer to read a comic or watch the comic in a movie version?
Oh, they're two different things. What I like about comics is how they can be perceived, as a whole page and as a panel and a sequence of panels, and how you can go back over it and look at stuff like that. And the the magic of comics, of sequential storytelling, is that the real magic is between the panels. That that the art is in making the reader imagine the fantastic stuff that happens between each panel. And that's where the real magic happens. That happens in each reader's individual head. When you see the movie, it's all just up there.
It's laid out for you.
Yes, it's all laid out. And in a comic book, you have to provide. You have to provide everything that's in between those two points.
So it can, in theory, be a different story for every reader based on how they read in between the panels.
Absolutely. And you could read so much into it. You're providing the tone of voice.
Mm-hmm.
You're providing the background music.
Absolutely.
And in a movie or TV show, it's all provided for you.
Okay, we've got one last question,
Okay.
and one of our viewers wants to know, when creating your comics, do you ever consider different cultural aspects, considering that your audiences may come from around the world?
Sometimes I do. It depends on what comic I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends on what the publisher is asking for. So.
Okay, so we've got about 2 minutes if you want to give us a few wrap-up nuggets of information, and just share with everyone maybe one final point you'd like to leave them when creating educational comics or using comics as educational tools.
Well, I think the main thing to remember is anybody can lay out information. It's the trick about making educational comics that anybody would want to read is you have to concentrate on creating a character to present it that the readership can identify with. It has to be specific to a locality. The character has got to be relatable. The character has got to be clear in their intention, and set that character in a really consistent environment, and give that character other characters to play off of, and that will get the message across. Making the message first is always a mistake, because you're making the character subservient to the message,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody cares about the message. It becomes, okay, the character is just there to tell you the message.
Right.
Well, what you want to create is something so that the character is there, and well, here's the message.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. I want to thank all of our viewers and our viewing parties in Lima, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Chile, and especially you, Larry. Thank you for taking the time to share all your wonderful advice and experience with everyone. This video will be available on YouTube following the program. And again, thank you, Larry, so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.